All right, so this week's topic we picked out is LBJ, Lyndon B Johnson, who was President of the United States, Vice President, Senate Majority Leader, Congressman, Senator, and one of the more important presidents in the 20th century. And I think the thing about LBJ is that, okay. Well, I'm being told to hold on a minute so people are logged on. So we'll just hang out for a minute. Drink one. Drinks.
So if you're watching us, feel free to say hi.
Yeah, say hi if you're watching. And if you have questions or comments, chime in. And the director, lovely and talented director, Miss Dara, will hit you up, make your voice heard. Should I go? Should I do it? All right, so let's talk about Lyndon Johnson. Okay, so Lyndon Johnson is an important president because he was president when very important things happened, but he's also kind of a really fascinating and significant president to study because when you look at a president like Nixon, his immediate successor, Nixon was an objectively bad guy, but on the other hand, he did some kind of strategically useful moves, did things for political reasons that turned out to be good, establishing the EPA and stuff like that. But I think for Nixon, there were always these crass motives, right? Nixon did these things because they were politically popular. It's hard to ascribe Nixon any sort of long-term political beliefs. Johnson, on the other hand, to get where he got and to be elected, was willing to do basically anything. But when he got power, he tried to use it in as humane and as effective a way as possible, which is, I think, is a really fascinating thing. And you would not know if you spent your life watching Johnson's career, you would not know that he would have done that. You would have expected different things from him when he became president, and yet when he was president, he didn't behave like he had behaved any other time in his career, almost, right? So Johnson's born in 1908. He's born in West Texas in the Hill Country. And the trick about the Hill Country is when the settlers came to the Hill Country, one of the great writers of it, I want to say it's Walter Webb. He described it as a trap, because you go out there and there's this thick carpet of grass in the 1800s, and people went out there and they thought, oh, this is great farmland, right? I mean, this is great. We're going to cut this turf up and we're going to plant crops. And of course, no, it's not. The grass has these roots that go down hundreds of feet. It's been there for hundreds of years. No one's ever tried agriculture here. There's never any rain. And so when the farmers cut up the turf, they turned the entire thing into a dust bowl. They cut up the turf, they cut up the grass, they started planting crops, and there was just no rain. There's no water. And you dig a well, the well goes down 500 feet before it hits water, because you're basically in what amounts to a desert. And so Johnson grew up as a very young boy in like lower middle class life, and ended up in a situation where his dad, Samuel E. Johnson, sunk all the family's money into a wash, a kind of a valley where he planted cotton, and it was going to bring in some money for the family. And then twice in 2 years, there was a flood. He went out there and plowed the cotton, and he got it all up and running, and then a flood came and washed it away. And it happened twice, and it ruined the family. They sank into sort of total poverty. His father had served as a member of the Texas legislature for a little while and was very respectable, was very well known and widely known for his probity. But he gambled the family's future on this kind of very reckless thing, and it sort of wrecked the family. And Johnson grew up in this sort of tremendous poverty. And right around the time he graduates high school, he had been known, by the way, there's a great story in the best biographies of him where he's talking to the class, and he says, I'm going to run for president one day, and I'm going to be president. And they're all laughing. They're like, none of us are going to vote for you. And he's like, well, you won't. I don't need your votes. I don't need you to vote for me. And so Johnson, when he graduates high school, is right into the teeth of the Great Depression. It's just this really, really awful time to be heading out into the world. And so he goes to college. Right? And he goes to Southwest Texas State Teachers College at San Marcos. Yes.
Hi. You just so I can make you take a breath and take a drink. Drink. And so that you can say hi to Cindy, my mom, and Tim and Corey are here with us. And then say hi, Stephanie, and hi, Sarah, and hi, Aaron, Evan. So, okay, you've taken a drink, and now you can resume with LBJ in college.
Okay. So he goes to this Texas Teachings College, and it's really, it's a pretty small, tiny little college with no budget or anything. But it's the depression is picking up. Work is really hard to find. And Johnson, he does okay. He's not interested in schoolwork so much. But what he begins to realize is that there's power, and power lies in the money the school allocates to pay for things like scholarships and student jobs. And he finds the dean of the college, and basically, to put it very bluntly, kisses the guy's ass. I mean, like, quite literally will sit at his feet in public and gaze up with him adoringly. And of course, Johnson, that's his strategy for the rest of his life, is find the most important guy in the room, kiss his ass until he loves you. Right? And it works because Johnson quickly finds himself in the position of being the guy that decides which students get student jobs. Right? And is the peanut gallery audible? Okay, so the trick with it is that in the teeth of the Depression, a student job can often be the difference between you continuing in school or not being able to continue in school, right? And so who decides which students get those jobs? Johnson does, right? If you're Johnson's friend, you get a job in the library reshelving books, you get a job in the cafeteria cleaning up tables, you get a job picking up, garbage on the campus. If you're Johnson's enemy, you're out, and you can't stay. You leave the school, and you have to go get work or something, right? And so Johnson sort of, politicizes this whole thing, right? And campus politics, if you know anything about campus politics anywhere, it's totally BS. Of course, school elections, right? But what Johnson does is he turns it into a potent weapon. He gets his own slate of candidates nominated, and they win all these elections. And he creates a secret political party that is so secret no one knows about it. And the bylaws say that if you get asked if you're a member of the party, you have to say that you're not. And as soon as you get asked, you get kicked out. So you're not lying. And then at the next meeting, you get sworn back in, right? And it's sort of this cutesy little thing. But that way, like, it's so secret, no one will admit to being a member of it, because as soon as you ask, they're not a member, they get kicked out. Yeah. Right. The first rule, the preppy athletic kids are in the White Stars, and Lyndon Johnson's buddies are the Black Stars. And so the first rule of the Black Stars is you don't talk about the Black Stars. And they crush the White Stars. Yeah. And so the way this works, and I'll give you a good story. There is a young woman who's a member of the White Stars, and she's going to run for student body treasurer, right? And she's running for student body treasurer. Her name is Ella Sorrell, right? And so Ella's on a date with a couple guys, and they get on the date, and they're in the car. I'm just really distracted. It's the problem. And so anyway.
No, my question was, she was on a date with a couple of guys at one time, or?
Well, I mean, she's like they like this is a double date. It's like her and another friend from the school. Yeah. No, this is still the 20s, okay?
Well, and that's just it. Being poly back then was not quite as big.
So now Ella and her friend are in the car. These guys pick them up. They drive somewhere. The guys are chatting them up, and they're like, "Where do you go to school?" And Ella pauses and is like, "We go to University of Texas at Austin." She lies about going to Southwest Texas State Teachers College at San Marcos. And Lyndon Johnson finds out about this, right? Lyndon Johnson finds out about it, and he weaponizes it against her to where he gets somebody to come to her and say, if you don't withdraw your candidacy from the treasurer race in student body government, I will run an editorial in the newspaper that says that you won't admit you go to our school, you're ashamed. Right? And Ella, by the end of the date, had said that she had been not truthful to the guys, and they didn't care, I mean, whatever. But she kind of was ashamed. She admitted to a reporter later that, like, yeah, I was kind of a little ashamed that I went to this, like, poor kids college, right? And so she backed down. Lyndon Johnson blackmailed someone to drop out of a race for student body treasurer, right? That's what he did. In the yearbooks, which he tried to get rid of by the time he was president, everybody got a nickname. All the seniors had their pictures in the yearbook with little captions, and he was called Bull Johnson. And he was like, I was a bull, I was all tough. And everybody was like, no, you were a bull is for bullshit, right? But of course, he was very cautious about that in later years, trying to cover it up a little bit. So Johnson graduates college, and he's got a teaching job, right? Teaching degree. What does he do? Oh, actually, he goes down to this little tiny town on the border of Mexico, way down in South Texas, called Catala. And in Catala, it's one of these little towns where when Texas became America, or it became Texas and quit being Mexico, it switched sides, right? The border basically, moved south, and all these little towns on the north bank of the Rio Grande River stopped being Mexico and started being America. And one of the conditions of the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was that all of the people living in these towns had to become American citizens. The Mexican government didn't want to surrender this territory without some guarantee that its former citizens would be treated reasonably equitably by the American government. So if you go down there, even in the 20s and 30s, these little towns look like Mexico. They're full of people who you would swear are Mexicans, ethnically, linguistically, whatever. And of course, they're American citizens. And so Lyndon Johnson is down there teaching these kids English. And all of them unanimously were interviewed years later by reporters when Johnson became famous. They kind of tracked him down. They tracked this town down. What they ended up finding out is these kids loved him. They said, look, nobody ever gave a crap about us until Lyndon Johnson showed up, and they paid him like $2 a month or some horrible nothing salary. But he taught us English because he told us we were Americans, and this was how we were going to have a better life, and we needed to learn it, and this was important. The janitor was this elderly guy from the town, and he said Johnson paid out of his pocket for an extra set of school books and taught the janitor English at night. When he didn't have to. And the janitor said he had to teach me English, and he didn't being paid to do that, but he did anyway because he saw me listening to the lessons during the day and like peeking my head in the door to like listen to him talking. And so Johnson could have done nothing like every other teacher that had ever been assigned to the public school in Cotulla, Texas. Instead, he gave it his all. Why? Because he was this guy who felt that you had to give 100% effort. If there was something you could do, you should do it. If there was a thing that you were trying to do, maximum effort. Right? But also he had a tremendous amount of sympathy for these people who through no fault of their own were like stuck in terrible poverty. They didn't speak English in a country where that was what you had to do to get away or to get ahead rather. And so it's just chaos in the background. It's just chaos. Drinks. Yeah. Drinks.
I'm gonna. I have to be messing with
something so that I can figure out how to have my mic work when I don't actually want to be in the picture.
Okay. You can just be in the picture.
I don't want to be in the picture that much. I'm in it a little bit. I don't want to be in it that much.
All right.
Okay, Stephanie, can you hear me now? Is that sounding better or am I not on volume still?
There's a huge lag.
There is a huge lag. I'm aware of that. But yeah, people are wondering if they should be drinking or if...
Yeah, I mean, if you guys want to drink, Lyndon Johnson would want you to get drunk.
It's my kind of president.
Yeah, no, he would want everybody to get a little happy. Yeah.
Okay.
Should I keep going?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Johnson goes up to Central Texas after he gets out of the job. He goes to Johnson City, and he always, by the way, said that Johnson City was named for him, although everyone knew that it wasn't. And then he ends up in Austin. He coaches debate for a while, and the same thing. He views the debate as like these kids in this poor high school. Debate is like they're going to put it on their resume. This is going to get them to college, and they win. They win a state debating championship in Johnson's first year because he busts their ass. Right? He says if there's a thing you can do, do it. We get memorize every fact you can think of, practice every speech, practice your opponent's speeches, and again maximum effort. Right? So Johnson ends up at this time going up to Washington D.C. to work as a page in Congress. And what he does, by the way, is every congressman has pages, and the pages actually run like a shadow Congress, sort of like the model UN at your local high school. But Johnson, how old is he? Oh God, he's in his like 20s.
Typically a lot younger.
He was into one. He was into it after he got out of college. So he would have been like mid-20s. And so Johnson turns the whole page system into like an actual like thing that matters. Like he stages real debates about real issues. The congressmen come and watch the debates to see what the pages from the other side will say. I mean, it turns this whole thing. And that's when he meets, of course, Sam Rayburn, who is the incredibly influential member of the U.S. House, the Speaker of the House, who Johnson, of course, like just like the dean at his college, Johnson identifies Rayburn as the most powerful man in the room, and so he basically kisses up to Rayburn for like the rest of his career, right? And he becomes this sort of lips permanently attached to Rayburn's posterior, right? I'll give you a great story about Sam Rayburn. At one point, they're running a bill in the House, and Rayburn has the votes. He has the votes to get it passed, right? And so I see you dancing, yes. And so they're doing the roll call, right? The clerk's got the sheet. He's calling roll by name, and it comes to a congressman, and the congressman votes the opposite way that Rayburn had understood he was going to be voting. So Rayburn stops the voting, goes to the clerk, takes the sheet, rips it up, gets a new sheet, and says to the clerk, start over the voting. And then he walks directly over to a member of the House and stares at him until it's that guy's turn to vote. And that guy, of course, is terrified and votes the way Rayburn wants. And then Rayburn sits back down and the bill passes. Right? And so Rayburn, and there's a reason why the House office building is named the Rayburn office building, right? And so having said that, how does Lyndon Johnson get into Congress? Well, he starts working for a South Texas congressman, a guy whose district is on like the Gulf Coast, like Corpus Christi and stuff. And this guy basically wants to just drink, sleep with hookers and play golf, right? And Johnson is happy to run his office. Johnson runs his office like a well-oiled machine. A big part of Congress in those days is fielding calls from your constituents who have they want to get a pension and they can't figure out how to do the paperwork. They have a problem with their VA stuff. They all this kind of what they call constituent services. And Johnson turns this guy's office into a machine. They answer every piece of mail. They answer every phone call. They work, and it works. I mean, it happens, right? And so Johnson does this for a while. And the problem is he's stuck in a situation where he's never going to be able to get into Congress. He's got to wait for like a seat to open, right? And so, having said that, we can also mention Johnson has a bit of a detour into the New Deal at this point. By the 30s, Johnson, of course, a lifelong Democrat, like literally every political figure in the American South, right? There's literally no other political party for you to join. Johnson ends up working for the Roosevelt administration as the head of a program called the National Youth Administration in Texas. The NYA was one of Eleanor Roosevelt's brainchilds, and the idea was to take kids who need summer jobs and like high school kids and put them to work doing something so they would have money to support their education. Because otherwise you've got all these kids who can't go to school because the government's making all these jobs that are going to unemployed adults, right? And the NYA is hard because you got to give jobs that like high schoolers could do, but also you can't poach anything from the other big New Deal programs like the CCC or anything else, right? And so Johnson ends up being the youngest state director of any of the NY agencies. He's in Texas, right? And he gives you a bird's eye view in his reporting about it later and what he talks about later, about how it was total chaos. He said that at one point the government was giving them literally bags of money. That one guy left a bag of money in the diner and ended up driving back like 50 miles. And the waitress was like, "Yeah, we just put your package under the counter." And he was like, "Thank God it was a bunch of cash that we like got out of the bank to pay, contractors, whatever." And they had a terrible time finding things to do. They came up with finally building highway rest stops on state highways in Texas. They would build a little concrete brick bathroom and then like picnic tables and a gazebo and like a barbecue pit, with like a grill. And they figured that was like a thing that they had the money, they could do this, no one else was doing it, and they could put like high school kids to work in the summer doing this stuff, right? And so Johnson said every day what they would do is they would just do all this work in the office, and then on the way home, he would go home and he'd stop and get beers. Someone would grab hot dogs and burgers. Somebody would get the new paperwork from Washington, and then all get into Johnson's little house in Austin, and they would read out all of the new regulations, the New Deal regulations, and then Johnson would end up saying to people, "What the hell does this mean? Does it what is this new rule about how we spend our money mean, or what is this new rule about how what jobs we can do mean?" And they would try to figure it out. And Johnson was like, "We're not lawyers. We're just kind of making this stuff up, right?" Is there other questions or anything?
Drink. I mean, always drink.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, there was a comment referencing Lone Star Beer Armadillo. And then also Matt Hawkins, he says, "I trust we'll get some references to Jumbo."
Oh, he's coming. He's coming. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're going to talk about it. And so Johnson actually ends up getting in Congress in, I want to say it's 1937. So 37 or 37, I think. So the talk of the town is that Roosevelt runs and wins re-election. And after his re-election, he proposes a plan, and this is where Hawk is going to love it because we're going to talk about Hawk's favorite thing, court packing. The Supreme Court has been striking down New Deal regulations at an alarming rate. And so it's great, right? I mean, if the Supreme Court ain't gonna do a lot, just we'll create some new seats. So what FDR proposes is a bill that would reorganize the federal court system, which is probably needed, and at the same time, it would also add a number of seats to the Supreme Court. And the way it would work is for every judge over 70, and there are 6, you would end up being able to either make that judge retire immediately and replace him, or just add a new seat to the court that you could then fill. And of course, however this works out, FDR would add up to 6 people to the court immediately. And of course, the number one qualification would be, how do you feel about the New Deal? Because if you hate it, I'll call you. But if you love it, how about a job on the Supreme Court? Am I right? And so FDR figured he'd won a big election in 32 against Herbert Hoover. He had won an even bigger election against former Kansas Governor Alf Landon in 36. He can do what he wants. Like, the people have spoken, right? But of course, all over the country, Republicans have been looking for 4 years for something bad to say about FDR. How do we attack FDR, who wants to help poor people, without looking like a horrible jerk yourself? Well, here it is, right? You just wrap yourself in the Constitution and you just say, guys, I just love the Constitution so much. And it's all BS. The Republicans are, whatever. But it's finally a political weapon they can use against FDR that doesn't land them accusations of plutocracy, right? Finally, they're not just a bunch of rich guys that don't want to pay taxes. They are guys that really care about Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Right? And so Lyndon Johnson, in this environment, a Congress seat opens up in South Texas, and he jumps on it, right? And it's a huge primary, the Democratic primary. And remember, in the South in those days, there is no general election. It is only the Democratic primary. There's no Republicans. One guy said that there are 2 Republicans in Texas, and they both meet in the dark with the lights off, so they don't know who each other are. Because they're so embarrassed. And he said, frankly, if you ran as a Republican, you might get 2 votes, you and your mom, and your mother would lie to her friends. And so that's how unpopular. And of course, why is this the case? Because the Republicans are the party of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. And of course, African Americans would probably be Republicans. But remember, thanks to Jim Crow, they don't vote, right? And so having said that, the Democratic primary basically is the election, right? If you win the primary, you cruise to an easy victory in the basically uncontested November election. The Republicans usually run some guy who gets, again, the proverbial 2 votes, right? And so Johnson has to come up with a strategy, and the strategy has to be, how do you out-Democrat 12 other Democrats? Yeah.
Can you talk about the Republican and Democratic parties vis-a-vis what they were then versus what they are now? I know the party of Lincoln.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the parties are a little different, right? After the Civil War, the Republican Party supported African-American rights and Reconstruction. But by the time Reconstruction ended, the Republican Party began to transition towards its more modern kind of small government, pro-business ideology. The Democratic Party's always been a bigger party. It's more of a coalition between 2 different groups, Northern, particularly Northeastern Democrats and Southern Democrats. The Northeastern Democrats were honestly part of a kind of a bipartisan consensus with the Republicans about things like the gold standard, high tariffs, limited government intervention in the economy, support for business, and that kind of thing. And the Southern Democrats, of course, were basically pre-Civil War Southern conservatives, right? I mean, their one defining issue tended to be support for segregation and support for Jim Crow. And the reason the Northern and Southern Democrats worked is that they liked beating Republicans, right? Southern Democrats would vote for Northern Democrats, and Northern Democrats would get presidents elected and majorities in the House and Senate, and in return, everybody would just be quiet about how bad Jim Crow was, and the Republicans sort of couldn't do much about it. The Republicans ran on the whole party of Lincoln thing forever, but of course there's a realistic argument to be made that by the early 20th century, they hadn't really done very much for black voters in a while, right? And so Johnson is a weird guy. Johnson is a Democrat, a Southern Democrat, but arguably he's more Western than Southern, right? But Texas is a Southern state, but really Texas is kind of, West Texas and East Texas are not necessarily so much the same thing, right? And so as a consequence, Johnson exists in this party that is this very uneasy marriage. And over the years, the Southern Democrats have maintained extremely conservative views on race. That is the litmus test for a Southern Democrat is, do you support segregation and Jim Crow, our institutions, our way of life, and that sort of thing. And the Northern Democrats have increasingly begun to kind of challenge it a little bit. They introduced lynching legislation into the federal Congress, which would make lynching a federal crime, investigatable and punishable by the federal courts. Which would be a big deal. The Southern Democrats like oppose that. And of course, everybody knows, everybody's a Democrat knows that if the Northern liberal Democrats go after segregation, it would blow the party apart. And of course, the Republicans would just kind of quietly stand over and say nothing and then just walk in and sweep up the mess, right? They would be picking up the elections. And of course, you can't run a Southerner for president because inevitably Northern voters would ask questions of the Southerner like, can black people exist as human beings in your state? Can black people vote in your state? Is the Confederacy awesome? And no Southern politician could go up to New Hampshire, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Ohio, and have any kind of conversation about what things were like in the South and hope to survive, right? But of course, if you're a Southerner, that's fine. You back your Northern Democratic presidents and you just let it ride, right? And so if you think about it today, of course, today you think of traditionally white conservative Southerners as being Republicans. That has not happened yet in this part of the lecture that we're in. It's not a thing yet. White conservative Southerners vote Democrat. right? And it's not that all of the white conservative Southerners sort of teleported away and replaced by different people. It's that politics kind of changes under their feet, right? Things change under their feet. And the Republican Party, for now, is content to do very well in the northern states, the more populated northern states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the upper Midwest, parts of the Northeast. They do well in those states. So they're content to sort of allow that situation to ride, not knowing any real way to sort of, deal with it, right? I mean, enfranchising black voters in the South would be a great way to earn Republican votes, but that would also destroy the racial consensus that has held the country together since the end of Reconstruction in 1876. And so that's the sort of political environment that Lyndon Johnson's kind of operating in at this time, if that makes any sense. Okay, any more questions or anything? So Johnson gets into Congress, and he does it in an ingenious way. He says to his political advisors, "I'm 100% New Deal." And they laugh and they're like, "Dude, Lyndon, everybody's 100% New Deal. This is Texas. It's the South. It's Democratic territory. Nobody does not love FDR." And Johnson's like, "Look, people love FDR, but they're not for the court packing plan, right? Everybody's denounced that. I'm going to be 100% for the New Deal and FDR, including the court packing plan." And it's an incredibly cheap thing because Johnson doesn't have to actually, he can say, "I love the court packing plan," but he's not a congressman. He doesn't have to go there and actually vote against for a law, rather, that's actually probably unconstitutional, right? And FDR is having a huge blowback, and his vice president goes to the Senate and says, you don't have the votes to pass this. This is going to blow up in your face. And so FDR reluctantly compromises, which is, by the way, that's how Congress works. You compromise, you submit a bill, maybe the Congress marks it up, you accept that everybody gets half what they want. But FDR doesn't do that. He's freaking FDR. He does whatever he wants. He writes the bills and Congress passes them. They pass bills that haven't been written yet. Because FDR tells them to do it, right? And so for FDR, it's a huge come down to admit that the court packing plan didn't work out. But Johnson runs on it. He says, if I was in Congress, I would have been 100% FDR. And the crowd is like, well, everybody would have. And Johnson's like, who here would have supported the court packing plan? I would have. My opponents, they wouldn't have. And the opponents are like, yeah, it was unconstitutional. And Johnson's like, you see, these guys aren't 100% FDR. And it works. He gets into the Congress. What does Johnson do in the Congress? Not a goddamn thing. Nothing. There's too many people in Congress. You can't manipulate people in the way that you could in a smaller venue. There's a couple hundred members of Congress. What can you do? And so he makes essentially no mark in the Congress. He passes no bills. He introduces no legislation. He does essentially nothing. And then comes World War II. Yeah. What was it a thing?
I was going to share Hawk's comment that someone should tell that to Mitch McConnell.
Well, I mean, passing bills is sort of what the Congress is supposed to do. But I mean, hey, what are you going to do? Right. And so having said that, Johnson always said, I will never vote to send our boys to go fight in any war that I don't immediately resign and go fight in myself. So, of course, you can stall 1939, 1940, 1941, December 7th, 1941. Now it's on. And so in the spring of 1942, when Johnson is on record supporting things like Lend-Lease that increasingly pull America into the war in 1941, and then, of course, Pearl Harbor, which sends us directly into the war by 1942, Johnson is forced to confront the fact that if you don't do something about World War II, your political career is over, right? I mean, you're done, right? At this point, we should mention he's married to Claudia Alta Taylor, Lady Bird, as they call her. She had an African-American maid who told her she was as pretty as a Lady Bird, so that was Lady Bird Johnson. They called her. And Johnson liked it because Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, Lady Bird Johnson, LBJ. They named their kids Linda Baird and Lucy Baines. So it was all LBJ all the time. And so Johnson married Lady Bird, and she was a smart lady. She was so shy that at her high school graduation, she was the valedictorian. She had to give a speech, and the night before, she prayed to God that she would get smallpox and not have to speak at her graduation. Which she confessed to somebody later, and I didn't really know how bad smallpox was. I might have asked for bronchitis or something, but she came out of her shell having to campaign a couple times for Johnson. I think in the House race, he ended up getting appendicitis and collapsed on the campaign trail, and so she took over and he got an appendectomy. And he had heart problems later, and she had to step in for him too. And so Johnson ends up finagling a great deal where he becomes an inspector of airfields in Southern California in 1942 and 3. And he gets a uniform. There's pictures of him in his Wikipedia article in his Navy uniform. He looks sharp. What does he do? He and a buddy fly out to California 1 weekend a month. They rent a car. They get hammered. They pick up some hookers. They eat a bunch of beefsteaks. They drive around, look at an airfield. I mean, I don't know. It looks like an airfield or whatever. You guys seem doing great. All right. And then you go back to Washington. You claim that you're a reserve naval officer, and you say, "Hey, I just went where the Navy told me to go." Right? I mean, I would not be out there killing Japanese guys but I mean, they told me to inspect airfields in Southern California. So I'm just going where the Department of the Navy, and it's like, yeah, where you slipped some people some money, and they made it happen for you, whatever. And so Johnson realizes later in the war that he really has to go out and see combat, and he does. And this is the crazy thing: Johnson gets a plane out to inspect airfields, and I think it's like Tulagi or Rabaul, which is in New Guinea, where the fighting with the Japanese is tremendous. And they go on a bombing raid to attack this Japanese airbase. And they get up in Johnson actually at the last minute, one plane is not ready, and he's worried he's not going to have space, so he jumps in another plane. And is like, I'll just go on that one because the reporter, whoever's going to go, is in the bathroom or something. And the reporter runs out, and his plane is left, and like, no, go on the plane that Johnson was going to go on. And so Johnson ends up on not the right plane, and he's in the plane. It's terrifying. You're in this kind of unheated plane. It's like rattling. There's Japanese flak coming in, shaking the plane. There's all these fighters around it. And the crew said Johnson could have just sat there, hugged his knees, and cried the whole time. But he actually stuck his head in one of the observation turrets and called out the vectors of approaching Japanese fighters so that the machine gunners could get a better line on them. And they bombed Tulagi, the mission. They did their mission. And when they flew back, the plane was completely shot full of holes. And they said Johnson was as cool as a cucumber, right? The plane, by the way, that he was originally going to be on, I think, is what got shot down, which everybody remarked as being one of those eerie kind of coincidences, right? And so Johnson was able to get, like, he got himself like the Navy Cross or some damn thing. Yeah, he could. I mean, he could have. He could have used his connections to get himself out of it, but he didn't. He was able to go and say, look, I saw fire, and there were people he got on stage in his later campaigns who were like, yeah, Johnson was in the plane with us. We took Japanese artillery fire. That's true, right? Did he massage the story a little bit? Yeah, of course. But for the rest of his life, by the way, on his jacket, he wore the little lapel pin for the Navy Cross. Right? They give you the medal and they give you a little pin, and he wore the pin, which is like a little, much, right? So Johnson realizes in 48 there is a Senate election. He's running against legendary Texas lawmaker Coke Stevenson, who is this icon in Texas politics. Johnson runs a dirty campaign, and he beats him, and he cheats. He gets in close with the barons of Duval County, South Texas, not Duval County, Florida's Duval County, Texas. Baron of Duval, and Johnson buys votes. What they do in South Texas, you never, ever, 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 ever report totals until all of the counties have come in. Because if you report a county total, it's done, it's locked, you can't go back. If you sit on the numbers until all the counties report the votes are counted, then you can't cheat, right? And so what Johnson does, what Coke Stevenson, the mistake he makes, is he starts reporting totals that are in his favor in North Texas. Johnson starts starts stuffing ballot boxes, right? And in Duval County, Texas, Johnson wins like 97% of the votes, including hundreds and hundreds of people who are not real. And what Johnson does is they call down there with a number. We need 500 votes from your county. And they print up 500 ballots, sign them with fake names, shove them in the ballot box. The guy that does it is an enforcer for the guy that runs the county, basically like a 19th century Mexican, landowner, like a jefe. And the guy's name is Salas. And Salas says it was basically like that. This guy ran the county, owned all the land, gave everyone jobs, was in charge, controlled everything, and I was his right-hand man. And in the 70s, no, it was in the 80s, Robert Caro found the guy, and in a safety deposit box in a bank in Texas, he had an account of stuffing the ballots in the 1948 Senate election. And Lyndon Johnson wins the election by 87 votes. Landslide Lyndon. They call him Landslide Lyndon. And he goes to the U.S. Senate. And this is Johnson's idea of it. The Senate is just shy of 100 people. You could know everybody. You could know their names. You could really get to know them. You could manipulate them. It was a place where deals could be made and things could be done. And Johnson rapidly rises to the top in the Senate, and he's got a whole bunch of things going for him. He's this personal, outgoing guy. He's friends with everybody, and he's a master manipulator of people. He knows more than anybody else how to get somebody on your side. And for Johnson, it's all about back and forth. I mean, you pass a bill for me, I pass a bill for you, we make deals. There's this inexhaustible tap of money that is the American government. And all we have to do is direct it to things that we want. And those things, it can splash on a thing you want, and it can splash on a thing I want, and we can shake hands on it, right? You need a dam, a high school, a road, an airport. You're trying to get reelected. So, okay, we'll do something for you, right? Everybody's got something they want. Everybody's got something they need, and we can make deals. And Johnson is a master. Frankly, if the Senate is a musical instrument, then Johnson is its master player par excellence. There's never been a senator as effective as him ever, right? And of course, Johnson he plays dumb. Right? But he is incredibly savvy. He's incredibly smart. And of course, he's almost scatological, right? He has this big office they call the Taj Mahal because pretty rapidly he gets elected Senate Majority Leader. They refit this office. It's all gold leaf. It's all hideous. And Johnson has these big meetings in the Taj Mahal. By the way, they have peeing contests out the office window. Johnson meets reporters on the toilet, which seems incredibly scatological until of course, it's all calculated, right? You're sitting there talking with Johnson, trying to hold him to the fire about like, Senator Johnson, you've said this comments about the president, whatever. And Johnson is like, his aides are coming in to pass toilet paper over you or like handing it to you so you can hand it to John. How do you be serious with somebody when that's happening? You don't. And so Hawk asked for this, but there's a point at which a reporter follows him into the men's room to try to get a quote from him about something Johnson said. And Johnson is standing at the urinal and he pulls his pants down and he pulls his underwear down and he pulls out his penis and he turns and he says, "You ever seen anything that big?" And the reporter just leaves. It's just like, and then walks away. And of course, is Johnson, a frat boy? Yeah. But it's also this incredibly calculated, sort of sophisticated pose, right? So Johnson did call his genitalia jumbo, and he talked about it incessantly. Right, and again, it was part of it was that he really was this like scatological kind of gutter-minded person, but it was also part of projecting this act, right? That people would think of him as an idiot, right? They would think of him as being this sort of stupid fool, right? And so, what did Johnson do in the Senate? The Senate had been run according to a system called the seniority system, and the way it worked is that when you get sworn in by the vice president after you get elected, you start accruing seniority from the moment you're sworn in. And when the Senate is organized every 2 years, when senators come and go, they organize the senators into a list according to their seniority, right? And the seniority is how long you've been in the Senate, starting from the day you were sworn in by the vice president, right? And the trick is, northern senators come and go, right? Senators from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Massachusetts, they get Republicans and Democrats get elected, they defeated, whatever. In the South, there's only one party. If you're a Democratic senator, the only thing that makes you leave office is if you strangled somebody in public, if you died, and those are the only two things. And so you get these, yes.
Did any senator strangle someone?
I mean, probably.
Sorry, repeating the question. Did any senator?
I mean, you could probably find some. Some of those dudes, James Eastland, Ted Bilbo, those are some bad guys. Eastland was so racist that Lyndon Johnson said, just to an aide, if the Mississippi River topped the levees, James Eastland would go on TV and say it was black people that did it and they had help from the communists.
Sarah wants to know if that's how we got the term Johnson.
I don't know, although maybe.
And drinks.
Yeah, let me have a drink. Yeah.
You should just hold that glass.
I mean, I got to talk with my hands.
Yes, but
No,
I mean, you're keeping little babies.
I had a lot of wine last week.
That was last week.
It was last week.
I had a lot of
You
wine.
know, the wine last week too. Yeah, I know. So Johnson, the seniority system is in a way is like stultifying because if you look at all the important committees where all the important work of the Senate gets done, it's all Southern senators. And part of it is by, they work out, but part of it is they're just the most senior members of the Senate, right? When you get a new election, you get some new senators, you replace some guys with seniority and some new guys come in with no seniority. The Southerners edge higher up the list. And so Senate Foreign Affairs, Intelligence, Armed Services, Ways and Means, Budget Committee, all of those chairmen are Southerners. And the committee chairman can really decide what a committee is going to do. They can bring in all the committee, and the way it works is the most senior Republican and Democrat are in the middle and around a U-shaped table, and you go around less senior. And you can have a bill that has been introduced to the Senate, and the committee chairman can say, we're not going to have hearings on this bill. I don't want to talk about it. Bang. And that's it. It's done. Bill goes away. It's gone. And the only way to get it out of the committee is a discharge petition, which like the entire Senate has to vote for. Right? And the Southern senator's not going to vote for that, right? They're not going to do that. And so on the other hand, they can say, look, we're not going to have hearings on this bill unless I want to or whatever. And so the senators have this sort of chokehold on Congress. And of course, the big thing is if a bill comes in front of the Senate and in the House, these bills happen all the time. The Northerners have a majority in the House. So they always introduce bills about like Jim Crow's bad, segregation's bad, lynching is bad. What do the Southerners do in the Senate? They step on those bills and crush them. They filibuster them, right? A senator can hold the floor of the Senate for as long as he wants, talking about whatever he wants, unless a supermajority of senators vote to make him shut up. And a supermajority would include, of course, members of that senator's party. And if that senator's a Democrat, it would include Southern senators, 22 of them from 11 Southern states, right? And so as a consequence, rest assured that if a civil rights bill hits the Senate, it'll be slow pedaled in committee. And if it got to the floor through some crazy cockamamie means, you could rest assured that a Southerner would stand up there and talk about whatever and kill it. And the threat is that if you're a senator and you want things to happen in this Senate term, then you better stop with the civil rights nonsense. We're not having education bills. We're not having a budget. We're not having defense spending. We're not having this aid to foreign countries, whatever. None of it's happening until you get rid of this civil rights nonsense, right? And so the filibuster is a powerful weapon, and the Southerners are not shy about using it, right? And having said that, in 48, the Southerners actually ran a candidate against Harry Truman for the crime of desegregating the U.S. military. It was Strom Thurmond and Fielding J. Wright, who were respectively from South Carolina and Mississippi. And the two of them ran as president, vice president against Truman, and they lost. And it was an ominous thing because it proved that maybe the Southerners didn't have the stranglehold over the Democrats they thought. The precipitating event, by the way, was at the Democratic Convention in 1948. The mayor of Minneapolis, Hubert Humphrey, of whom we will speak later, got up on stage and said that we had to include a plank in the platform condemning the Ku Klux Klan. And he said it is time for the Democratic Party to step out of the shadow of segregation and into the sunlight of civil rights. And he brought the House down, not the Southerners, obviously. And they walked out and had their own convention, elected Strom Thurmond. States' rights Democrats, everyone called him the Dixiecrats. He hated it, but he's a racist, so I don't care what he thinks. Right? And so what Johnson did is you realize the Senate was you're never going to do anything in the Senate until you break the stranglehold of these Southern senators. So he got rid of the seniority system. And instead, the majority leader decided who got on what committees. And just like Johnson had done with student jobs at Southwest Texas State Teachers College in San Marcos, he did with committee assignments. If your state has a bunch of Native American reservations, boy, Native American affairs would be good for you. If you're from Iowa, wouldn't agriculture be the committee you want? If you are a big guy about your campaign is all about how you're tough on national defense, wouldn't you like to be on the Armed Services Committee or the Committee for Waterways if you care about agriculture and you want a dam? And so Johnson parceled out those committee assignments like they were prizes. And the eligibility requirements were loyalty to him, right? And it worked. Johnson the Senate into delivering precisely the outcomes that he wanted, right? And by the way, he was great at it. His aides used to say that nobody worked harder than him and nobody knew things better. He used to quiz them. He had these big sheets they printed up with all the senators' names, and Johnson would say, let's talk about this bill. All of you guys fill out a tally sheet. Get 2 days to get your information, and I'll fill one out right now, yes or no. And in 2 days, when the vote happens, we'll see who was right. And they would discuss it, and Johnson would inevitably pull out his tally sheet, and it would be 100% correct. Johnson would have counted every single vote right, and he would say to his aides, "You got to know when you mark that vote. Senator Smith, yes or no. You got to know, and if you don't know, go find out. You can find out. You can talk to the guy. You can talk to his aides. You can talk to the guy in the elevator. You can talk to the person, the clerk. You can talk to the cafeteria attendants. You can find out." Right? And Johnson was never wrong, right? And he knew how to get votes. He had the treatment where you'd be walking in the hall, Johnson would just slam into you like a hurricane, and it would be, somebody described it as hot breath in your face, spit all over your eyes, your glasses fogged up, your tie sideways, a hand all over you, slapping your back, pumping your fist, and when it was left, you had been like completely disheveled, and yet you had agreed to something. Johnson had, you were going to vote for the thing or whatever, and Johnson told you to get him, put an amendment, put a rider on it, and you would pass it. You want a school or something, put it in there. And Johnson was a master at this level of manipulation. It worked. And so Johnson emerged as the most powerful Democrat in the country during the Eisenhower years, right? And a couple things. When Brown v. Board hit in 55, Johnson was in a tough spot because the Southerners lined up against Brown v. Board in the end of school segregation. Johnson was caught, and he didn't really care. He thought it was a bad issue. Privately, actually pretty sympathetic to African Americans. Publicly, though, you're a Southerner, you kind of gotta, it was, I want to say, only Estes Kefauver and Albert Gore Sr. didn't sign it, the Southern Manifesto, that all the rest of the Southerners signed opposing Brown v. Board, rather. And so Brown v. Board. And so, having said that, Johnson, and there's some interesting stuff he did, too. I want to say it was during this period that there was a Mexican-American, an American of Mexican ancestry who had died in the service. No, he died as a veteran, and his wife wanted him buried at in a veteran's cemetery. and they wouldn't do it because he was not white. And Johnson got him buried in Arlington National Cemetery and had a big funeral because he said, "Guys in uniform, what do you want me to say?" And he lobbied, he called the people. They wouldn't do it, and he's like, "Come on, this guy served the country. How do you?" And so Johnson seems to have this affinity for people who don't have any power, right? Who are being taken advantage of, who are being discriminated against. And he didn't have to do that. There would have been literally no repercussion for Johnson to say some horrible racial slur about some Mexican American guy and say like, well, whatever, I don't care. I mean, like a Southern politician saying disparaging things about a not white person in like the 50s is like a dog bites a man news story. But Johnson went on a limb. It was like, no, this guy we should not treat this guy badly. He's a veteran. Just like me, just like everybody else, right? And so the sort of defining moment comes when the civil rights movement begins to pick up steam in the late 50s, and Johnson wants to pass a civil rights bill. And he keeps telling the leader of the Southern senators, who is from Georgia, Richard Russell. He keeps telling Russell, if you don't pass a civil rights bill, they're gonna do away with the filibuster. They're gonna manipulate the Senate. They're gonna go outside of the system. The liberals have been pushing for this for like 80 years. You got to give them a break. And Russell's like, I don't have to give them a damn thing. Russell, by the way, was this lifelong bachelor, deeply educated guy who used to go read Greek and Latin at night in his house, but a staunch segregationist. And Russell thought of himself as like he's not one of those KKK people in the woods with the buck teeth and the pickup truck. I mean, he's got a 3-piece suit and he's an educated man. I mean, yeah, he's racist, but not like, he doesn't say the N-word in public kind of racist, And Johnson finally, prevailed on him. He's like, look, you got to let the dam give a little, or they're going to take it down, damn the consequences, right? I mean, they're going to flood the country because you won't let them have an inch, right? They win election after election. They have majority in the House, and you don't seem to care. And, of course, Russell, he didn't realize until one of the Southern senators runs for president in like 56. And all the senators love him. They're like, oh, we love you. We know you. You're the greatest. We are all friends. I love your wife, and she's so wonderful. And he goes up to like New Hampshire, and he gets into like 19th place or something. And when he asks everybody why, they're like, well, look, you're just a member of the fucking KKK. I mean, and he's like, I'm an upper class person. And of course, people in like New Hampshire, Vermont, or whatever, they're like, we didn't know that people in the South, like, we all figured everybody was a racist down there, right? I mean, like, you're all members of the KKK, right? And Russell sort of finally realized that Northerners, they had no idea. They all thought Southerners were these bigoted racists. And of course, remember, he didn't think of himself as a bigoted racist. He was a nice racist, right? Yeah, I mean, he had a suit and tie, right? And so Russell became obsessed with getting a Southerner to be president. He said, we're not going to be over the Civil War until the Southerner is accepted by Northerners as the president of the United States. And Johnson said, you know what you can do? You can pass a civil rights bill. I'll pass a civil rights bill. And of course, the unspoken ... is that will make me the first Southerner to have done so since ever. And boy, wouldn't that be an arrow in my quiver for running for president? And so just like he had sucked up to the dean at his college, just like he sucked up to Rayburn, he got on the good side of Richard Russell. Richard Russell knows where all the bodies are buried. He knows where all the rules. He has a mastery of parliamentary procedure like no other, right? And so, as a consequence, Johnson is able to make this happen. And they passed in 1958. They passed the civil rights bill. I want to say there's a 57 bill and a 58 bill. And the 58 bill is huge. It is one of the first major pieces of civil rights legislation passed since the 1860s or 70s. There's one hook. At the last minute, the Southerners slip into it a bill, a rider that says that any civil rights crime violation that is tagged as a federal crime has to be tried in front of a jury in the jurisdiction where it is alleged to have committed. And it's a poison pill, right? I mean, some white guys beat up a black guy and shoot him, and instead of being tried in federal court in like Illinois in front of a bunch of Northerners who were not necessarily inclined to care, it's going to be tried in the county courthouse, right? Right in front of all the locals, right? And of course, this harks back to like the Emmett Till case in the mid-50s where Till was visiting Mississippi from Chicago, got beaten to death, and a local jury took like 10 minutes to acquit the murderers despite a positive identification and like physical evidence and everything, right? And so that was precisely why civil rights crimes had to be eligible to be tried in federal court. And Johnson got a bill passed that did that, but also there was a backdoor that would let in a local jury to the federal court, right? But Rayburn was willing to let it happen, not Rayburn, what Russell was willing to let happen because that got the bill passed. And now he was able to say like, look, this is like a great step, right? And of course, everybody who was black in the civil rights movement was like, well, it's a a great step, right? I mean, like, not really. It's a federal law that makes it impossible to punish the people accused of violating the federal law. So then comes 1960, and Johnson, against all odds, decides this is his moment. He's been Senate Majority Leader for 2 terms. You don't want to wear out. Instead, you don't want to spend your life in the Senate, right? He runs for president. He runs for president against 2 other towering figures in the Democratic primary, JFK. And against his Republican opponent, former vice president, former senator, former congressman, Richard Nixon, right? Richard Nixon. And so Nixon, of course, easily wins the Republican primaries, former vice president, right? Kennedy and Johnson go all the way to the convention. Johnson loses at the convention, but Kennedy is wary of Johnson's Southern support. He thinks that from Massachusetts, he doesn't have the ears of the Southerners, so he offers Johnson vice president. He gets Kennedy in a power play. He gets his brother to offer it to Johnson. And Johnson agrees. And of course, Bobby Kennedy hates Lyndon Johnson, thinks he's a cornpone, idiot, stupid, hick redneck. And Lyndon Johnson thinks that Bobby Kennedy is a stuck-up little son of a bitch. And so JFK makes Bobby go down there and eat shit and offer the vice president's the VP slot to Johnson, and Johnson stuns everybody and takes it. And it's a horrible thing to do. You're the Senate Majority Leader. Eisenhower's president. Who's the most powerful man in Washington? Sometimes Eisenhower, the rest of the time Lyndon Johnson, who decides whether things go through Congress. He's got Mitch McConnell, of course, is arguably the most powerful man in Washington today. The government doesn't do anything unless it goes through the Senate most of the time, if it's going to be for real, and not an executive order that's going to get tangled up in the courts. And who decides that the Senate does anything? Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell, right? Lyndon Johnson is that guy. He's got his foot on the gas, foot on the brake, right? And so why would you go from that to the vice presidency? Johnson figures that's his shot. And of course, he knows I'm going to eat Kennedy's crap for 4 years, 8 years, I don't know. And I'm going to have to just put up with it. And Johnson hates it. He's the vice president for 3 years. It's the worst 3 years of his life, right? Johnson has done great things in the Senate. He revolutionized fundraising. He got his Texas oil buddies, a company called Brown and Root, owned by the Brown brothers. They gave Johnson his first $1 million cash. And they started backing his presidential his Senate campaigns and later his presidential campaign. And of course, later on, Brown and Root gets bought by another guy named Emergent, and it's Kellogg Brown and Root, KBR. And later on, KBR will become a fully owned subsidiary of Halliburton, which will have big ties to former Vice President Dick Cheney, right? Big oil services company, oil field services. And so Johnson has all these Texas oil millionaires, and they're hungering to do something. And Johnson gives them a way to send him money. Give me money, and I'll disperse it. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is a moribund institution. Johnson turns it into the premier fundraising apparatus that will allow the Democratic Party to steer money directly to candidates it thinks are most likely to win in November, which means those candidates will win and be loyal to the Democratic Party in the form of Lyndon Johnson. Right? And some of these guys, it's peanuts. It's like $10,000, $5,000, $2,000. So some of the letters coming in the mid-50s, they're like, please, $200 would let me put ads on the radio election day morning telling people to go vote. And Johnson is the guy handing out the money, which means he's the guy handing out the power. Right? And so Johnson ends up as vice president and is basically in purgatory, right? Through the entire Kennedy presidency, the escalation of the war in Vietnam, the escalation of the civil rights movement, University of Mississippi burning, the Freedom Riders, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Johnson is kind of he's just sort of missing in action. It's just gone, right? And this would have been the end, except, of course, November 22nd, 1963. Right, 11/22/63. Kennedy having had a big trouble with the polls in the southern states, thanks to his support for the civil rights movement, halting as though it was, right? Decides to go south on a tour of the southern states, shore up his base before the elections in 1964. And of course, Dealey Plaza, morning of November 22nd, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald shoots him in the head with a Mannlicher Caracana rifle he ordered out of the back, I want to say, of the NRA's magazine. Right, surplus World War II era 8mm Italian bolt-action rifle, and he killed Kennedy with it.
So Lee Harvey Oswald
The question is, was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone? It's a tough call because there's enough odd things about the Kennedy assassination to make you wonder about a conspiracy. The coroner who goes on and does the pathologist who does the autopsy, veteran guy, they replace him with the guy who's never done an autopsy before. Why would you do that? Why would you? The president is being autopsied. You would want the most experienced guy. Why did this guy never done an autopsy? He missed the entrance wound for one of the bullets in Kennedy's neck. Bullet entrance wounds are very small. Exit wounds are very big, and he missed the entrance wound. Like a veteran coroner would have known what to look for. You know, you'd see gunshot victims, right? There's enough weird, fuzzy things. Oswald gets assassinated by a gangster from Chicago like 2 weeks later as they're moving him from Texas custody to FBI custody, to Washington. That's weird. Why? Who would assassinate the assassin? Well, I mean, if you paid somebody to kill somebody, the best thing to do to make sure they don't testify is whack them, right? On the other hand, there's no evidence that Oswald acted in part of a conspiracy in terms of physical, hard evidence. There's no multiple gunshots, as far as we know. There's no tangible evidence that anybody other than Oswald was involved. There's just questions that can't really be answered, right? So Johnson is in the plane. He's in Texas. He's in Dallas, and never again will the Secret Service allow the president and the vice president to be in the same location unless it is Washington, D.C. If one of them leaves, the other one stays, and if the other one leaves, the other one stays. Yes.
Stephanie wants to know if the gangster liked JFK.
That's one supposition. Is Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner from Chicago, who was mobbed up, was a big fan of JFK. That's the thought. Is he was just disgruntled JFK fan who went down there and whacked Oswald, who was, of course, Oswald is the nutcase. He's a former Marine who got turfed out for psychiatric problems. He went to Russia and lived in Russia, which is like, who does that in the 60s? He married a Russian lady, Marina Oswald. And ended up, he was physically abusive to her. He tried to assassinate a general who was in Texas a couple weeks before Kennedy as like a test run to see if he could do it. And so he's just a all over the place guy who probably had serious psychiatric problems. And of course, here he is with shooting the president with a rifle. He killed a cop after he shot Kennedy. He hid the rifle in the third floor of the Texas School Book Depository overlooking Dealey Plaza. He interrupted a traffic stop, shot a cop, and then somebody called the police and said, "Oh my God, this guy just shot a cop in the street in front of in some suburban neighborhood." And Oswald got caught. Like that manhunt caught him in a couple blocks, right? And so my mom knew the cop that he shot. Actually, he was, when she worked in the ER, the cop used to bring in people who'd been beat up, and they'd get treated, suspects and witnesses, and he would buy all the nurses donuts. He would cuff the guy to the bed and then go get 12 donuts. And so Johnson's on the plane, and there's a famous photo that shows Johnson standing on the plane. Lady Bird is here. Lady Bird's over here, and Jackie Kennedy is on the other side, shell shock, covered in the same suit, the pink Chanel suit that's got her husband's brains all over it. He's getting sworn in. By the way, the judge swearing in Lyndon Johnson in the photograph is the first female federal judge in the state of Texas. He got her on the bench as a senator, and she paid him back years later by swearing him into the presidency. And so Johnson's the president, right? Now he can do like whatever he wants, right? And so for Johnson, there's a couple of things he wants to do. He's always wanted to do the New Deal and have it be bigger, right? The New Deal, but louder, bigger, crazier, more insane. And now he's the president, right? Also, civil rights. Johnson has opinions about this. And there's also, of course, this thing, Vietnam, right? This country in Southeast Asia that you got to do something about, right? But the first thing that Johnson does, his advisors sit down with him. They say, "Look, Mr. President, what are we going to do? You got a little bit of a honeymoon, right? There's a little bit of a honeymoon. You can kind of do what you want in Congress, and maybe a budget. We can get the budget passed." And Johnson says, "I want a civil rights bill." Kennedy was pushing a civil rights bill when he died. I want to take it over. I want to pass it. I want it to be for real. And his aides are like, "Look, that's stupid." And Johnson says, it's a very famous quote. He says to his aides, "If we can't pass a civil rights bill, if the presidency cannot be for this, then what is it for?" Right? And it's that thread that runs throughout Johnson's political career. Absolute, utter ruthlessness. So ruthless was Johnson that people thought he had Kennedy assassinated, which is, he didn't, but people believed that he might have. Right? Remember, this is a guy that did anything to get power. And yet, when he had it, what did he do? He supported the least powerful people in the country. And so Johnson introduced Kennedy's bill and said, we're going to pass it. We're going to pass it. And he said, "We shall overcome," the anthem of the civil rights movement. He quoted it in the Senate, which was just astounding. And they passed it. They passed the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. Johnson signed it and gave Martin Luther King the pen. Right? And so then comes the 1964 election. Disgruntled Republicans are the moderate Republican faction that has been kind of running the party is in for rebellion in 64. And there's a great scene. They're in the Cow Palace, which is a giant New Deal era building in San Francisco designed to have cattle auctions. And it's just your ordinary convention. New York governor, moderate Republican, Nelson Rockefeller, the third generation descendant of J.D. Rockefeller, is out there on stage talking about this. And angry movement conservative Republicans storm the hall and start shouting him down and booing at him. And they're there to pull for the Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. They have these badges say AUH2O, Goldwater, because they're nerds. And Goldwater gets up on the stage, and he's regarded as this completely fringe figure. And he gets up on the stage and he says, let's see if I get the quote right. He says, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation is no virtue. And when he says extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, the roof flew off. I mean, these people, that's what they wanted. For years, they had wanted there to be the great conservative activist, Phyllis Schlafly, who had really helped to get Goldwater nominated at this point. She wrote a book called A Choice, Not an Echo, describing what conservatives wanted. They wanted there to be an actual choice, not just some bullshit New Deal Republican who was slightly to the right of the middle. They wanted a real conservative, and Goldwater gave it to them. Right? He thought that Social Security was a pyramid scheme. He thought that the New Deal was socialism. He thought that federal aid to poor kids represented an unconstitutional infringement of states' rights. He thought that the Civil Rights Bill, which lifted black people out of the shadow of segregation, partially, he thought it was unconstitutional. Which was an amazing position. And so for conservatives, I mean, this guy is real. And so he's the presidential nominee. And of course, Johnson cut him up and served him like the proverbial Christmas ham. Right? Goldwater went to old people and said, I don't think Social Security should exist. So none of those people go vote for your check. Goldwater went to the poorest part of the country, West Virginia, and he said that Johnson's proposed aid to poor people, the war on poverty, should not exist. Check, those people aren't going to vote for you. And so Goldwater alienated old people, poor people, black people, who didn't, right? And Johnson ended up carrying, I want to say, he got every state except 5. Goldwater carried, ominously, he carried his home state of Arizona and 4 deep South states. I want to say it was South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. It might have been Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And so Goldwater, for the first time since Reconstruction, a Republican, won the Deep South. How'd he do it? Well, it turns out all those disgruntled conservative white Southerners whose nearest and dearest political virtue is support for segregation found out that their Democratic president didn't support segregation. And yet, Goldwater did, so they voted for him. Right now, Goldwater would say, I don't support segregation. I just don't think the civil rights law is constitutional. And of course, that's a nuanced position, as they say in politics. For Goldwater, for a white Southern conservative, what it meant was that you were anti-civil rights, which is all he needed to hear. He didn't need to know why. He just needed to know if. So Johnson's the president. And what does Johnson do? Well, a couple of things. First, Johnson supports the civil rights movement more. 1965 Voting Rights Act. That's Lyndon Johnson. Johnson embarks on the Great Society, his huge New Deal program. We're going to have block grants for poor communities. We're going to have Pell Grants for kids to go to college. We're going to have all kinds of scholarships. We're going to have federal aid for preschool, Head Start programs, school lunch programs, high school programs, middle school programs. We're going to have anti-poverty programs. We're going to have all kinds of tax reduction for poor people. We're going to do everything, this huge tap of government water, we're going to spray it directly on the poorest people in the country. And over the course of the subsequent decades, right, former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan was often fond of saying, we went to war with poverty and poverty lost. Paul Ryan's an idiot or a liar, because actually poverty plummeted for some groups of people, particularly poor white people. Right? And a lot of that was traced directly to Johnson's programs. But of course, also the thing that Johnson had to contend with was the Vietnam War. Right? The Vietnam War came out of the French government's attempt to retain control of its colonies in Vietnam. And during World War II, the Japanese occupied Vietnam, drove out the French, and thus proved that Asians could kick white people's asses if they tried, which was a very important lesson. And after the war, France came back, tried to assert control of Vietnam, and it didn't work. The Vietnamese didn't want it. They wanted independence. Right? Their leader, Ho Chi Minh, a.k.a. Nguyen Ai Quoc, a.k.a. Nguyen Tat Tra, he actually declared independence in Hanoi in 1945, quoting the Declaration of Independence. Right? And so after the French tried to reassert control, the Vietnamese went to war. Right? The Vietnamese went to war for their independence. And the French got their ass kicked, to put it bluntly. Over the course of a decade, the French fought, they lost. We brokered a peace treaty, and it held true for a few years. But of course, everybody expected it was just no one thought it was a permanent thing. Well, during the Kennedy administration, the North Vietnamese, the treaty had divided Vietnam in North and South. South Vietnam was controlled by an American and French-backed dictatorship. North Vietnam was controlled by the communists. The North Vietnamese began trying to topple the South Vietnamese government, which meant that we had to get involved, right? And the Kennedy administration gradually, like raising the temperature on a pot of water, gradually began to send in advisors and money and technology and air bases. And Johnson just upped it and upped the escalation. And Johnson was in a terrible position because the problem is He didn't care about Vietnam at all. It was a completely stupid thing. We should not have been there. It was a waste of time. But of course, Johnson knew, I can't not beat communism. I can't just abandon a country to communists. I would be vilified by the Republicans, right? McCarthy's a thing, right? But Johnson also knew, I can't be the first president to lose a war either. So we have to fight in Vietnam. But Johnson also had no interest in remotely trying to do this. He wanted out of the situation. For his entire presidency, he looked for a way to get out of Vietnam. He even offered to do a new deal in Vietnam. He said to the Vietnamese, if just ban communism, we will give you gajillions of dollars. And of course, they were not. I mean, that was they weren't willing to do it, right? And so over the course of his presidency, Johnson escalated the Vietnam War just a little bit at a time. Right? And of course, Goldwater famously said, either we send every American soldier and the nukes, or we get out. Right? And Johnson did this middle way where you just raise the temperature. And the old story, it's like the frog in the pot of boiling water. The hotter it gets, if you do it by degrees, the frog just adjusts. And the North Vietnamese adjusted. Their country was bombed worse than any country in the history of the world. We dropped more bombs in 1967 on Vietnam than we dropped on Germany in all of World War II. But they figured out how to deal with it. They compartmentalized their economy. They built dams and dikes. They buried everything underground. They infiltrated men into the South Vietnam through Laos, and they kept up pressure on the South Vietnamese government. And finally, by the end of Johnson's presidency, he was consumed by Vietnam. Right? All of the reforms that Johnson had done didn't seem to matter because Americans, particularly young Americans, were furious. They were furious that the civil rights movement hadn't seemed to end the injustices faced by black Americans. They were furious that every day thousands of people died in Vietnam and the government didn't seem to care. They didn't want to end the war or do anything. And so the protests all started, every protester in the 60s started as a civil rights protester and ended up protesting the civil rights movement, Vietnam, the system, Johnson, everything. And Johnson rapidly became embroiled in these scandals where it became obvious that he was lying. Johnson had always maintained this upbeat message. We're fine, we're winning, it's fine, we're winning, it's fine, we're winning. And by 1967, you say, we've been doing this for years, right? And it turns out, nobody believed him. The famous story was that Kennedy in the 60s had run on the credibility or the missile gap, that Russia had more missiles than we had. And it was BS, but it was a great story. We don't have enough missiles. They have more missiles. And of course, Nixon was in a position of saying like, well, that doesn't matter. Our missiles are better. And the joke about Johnson in the late 60s was there wasn't a missile gap. There was a credibility gap. It wasn't the difference between the number of missiles in America and Russia. It was the difference between what was true and what Johnson said. And famously, he had gallbladder surgery. And at a news conference, he lifted his shirt up to show the scar to prove that he had it. Because a reporter was like, really? And he was like, but of course, a newspaper columnist drew a picture of Johnson lifting up his shirt, and the scar was the shape of Vietnam. Right? Nobody believed anything Johnson said because then comes 1968. The North Vietnamese decided that after years of war, they could win it in one fell swoop. The Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday Tet takes place in January of 1968. It's a big block party. There had traditionally been a Tet truce. The North Vietnamese general, a guy named Vo Nguyen Giap, said, let's screw the truce. Let's infiltrate as many men as we can in December and then in the months before. And when Tet goes live, we pull the switch. And all over South Vietnam, we overthrow the South Vietnamese government. We kill the Americans. We win the war. We just sweep them off the table. And the Vietnamese leadership was divided into two factions. One faction favored keeping up the guerrilla war and the gradualist approach. And one faction favored Giap's approach, the kind of the old guard, right? And so the new faction would end up being the one that actually won, and the guy is I can't remember the name of the South Vietnamese guy, the North Vietnamese guy. It was Pham Van Dong was the prime minister. It was had too much wine, I guess. I'll think of it as soon as I stop recording. But the younger North Vietnamese were convinced that this was a bad idea. It was not going to work, right? And they would be proven, as it turns out, right. Right, and so having said that, stall for time trying to think of a name while you drink wine. But anyway, what happened in 1968 was in January. It was exactly what Giap had ordered. There were uprisings all over the South Vietnam. There was violence in the streets of Saigon, the capital, all the way from the Mekong River Delta up to the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. And it was humiliating for the Americans. On the one hand, we won the Tet Offensive. We crushed the Vietnamese. When the guerrillas came out of their proverbial camouflage, we annihilated them. The North Vietnamese army rolled into Hue, the northernmost city in South Vietnam. We crushed them. The U.S. Marines annihilated them. But the press coverage was withering. reporters in Vietnam would report, and they'd say, look, here's Johnson on the TV saying that, like, we're winning the war in Vietnam. It's basically won, right? Last week. Here's this week where I'm dodging bullets in the streets of Saigon. And, like, does this look like we won the war? I mean, does this, the U.S. Embassy got taken over by commandos who burned all the files and shot up the Great Seal of the United States of America, which was humiliating. And of course, the Marines quickly took the embassy back and killed all the commandos, but you couldn't erase the TV pictures of the embassy being shot up. And again, it made Johnson, it gave the lie to what Johnson was saying. We were winning the war. Does this look like winning? And of course, the protests redoubled and redoubled. So Johnson enters the presidential race in 1968, thinking he can easily cruise to a victory. Right? He won in 64 in one of the greatest landslides in American history, and he gets crushed. He gets crushed, actually, in a couple primaries. He gets beaten humiliatingly in one of the primaries by Robert Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, who is a senator from California, or senator from New York. And so it's humiliating. It's sort of utterly humiliating for Johnson to have been beaten by this brother of his former president. But and so to give you a really a sense of where Robert Kennedy was at, he had kind of come full circle. Kennedy's philandering had left a mark on Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, he hated it. He didn't want to clean up after anymore. His brother's sort of vague amorality he didn't like. His brother's sort of waffling, half-hearted support for the civil rights. Kennedy felt ashamed at that. He said we could have been doing now. We could have been doing then what we're doing now, right? And why weren't we? Right? Why weren't we? And so, having said that, he goes on a sort of poverty tour, right? They go down deep into Mississippi, and they go to this incredibly poor community full of sharecroppers. And Kennedy sits in a house with this African American kid, this little boy who's malnourished, lives in filth. And Kennedy was like, this kid is an American citizen, and like, how is this possible, right? It was a deeply marking moment for him. So to give you a story, there had been riots for the last couple of years. Every summer, things got hot. There would be a contention between black people and white people in the big cities, and there would be a riot. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is in Memphis, Tennessee. He's helping lead a protest in support of the garbage workers, who are mostly African American, treated very badly. On the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he's eating lunch, and they come out on the balcony, and they want to see speech. And so he goes to give a speech, and a guy named James Earl Ray shoots him and kills him with a rifle, kills him in the head, shoots him in the head. And it was just, Ray was a crazy nutcase, and he had it in for King, and he killed him. And he got away. He went to Canada, and then he went to England, and then he went to Spain, and he got caught coming back to England from Spain, I think. And so it was crazy, right? But that night in Indianapolis, Indiana, Robert Kennedy scheduled to give a campaign address, and the mayor withheld all news of the Kennedy assassination. He shut off the radio, shut off the TV in the town, which you could do in those days, right? Now the internet would make it impossible. So they tell Bobby Kennedy, you don't have to go to the town. There's going to be a riot. Like, the police are going to roll in, and when night falls, we're going to turn on the radio. People are going to hear. It's going to go crazy. And Bobby's like, no, I'll go. And you can watch the speech on YouTube. And he goes and he says, I just want to tell you that Martin Luther King was shot today in Tennessee, and everybody cries and is freaking out. And he quotes a poem by the Greek playwright Aeschylus, and he talks about, he said, my brother was shot by a white man, so I know exactly what it is like to have this happen. And he gives this speech about how we've got to come together, we've got to rise above this level of violence. This is not what we need to do to tear ourselves apart. And I mean, the guy looked presidential. And of course, Johnson watched the thing too. And so by this time, Johnson is out of the race. He threw it towards his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. And he said Humphrey, of course, was the most progressive guy around. But for many liberal Democrats, he had been tainted by his associates with Johnson. Because he was Johnson's vice president, he had to support Johnson's policies, which meant supporting, of course, the Vietnam War. Right, and there was just nothing you could do. For many liberals, that was it. You can't support a guy who thought bombing, Vietnamese kids was okay. And so Johnson's out, and so Hubert Humphrey is the establishment candidate. Yeah.
I feel like we missed a lot, like with the space program. And
we didn't talk about the space program. I mean, it was that's a whole other thing. Yeah, it was a whole other thing. That was more of a Kennedy thing than a Johnson. Like, Johnson didn't hate the space program, but like that was a Kennedy thing. We're gonna go to the moon by the end of the decade. Johnson was like, sure. I mean, I'm not gonna stop it.
Issa's making
Yeah. All right, laser cat. It's Isabella Castamera, Isabella of Castile, history cat. So not impressed. You want to say you're famous? Isa, everybody on the internet loves you.
Not impressed.
Not impressed. Okay, I love you. And so Johnson, quits the presidency. He effectively retires. It's very it's happened before, right? I mean, like Calvin Coolidge did it and decided not to run for another term. It's happened before, but he basically retires. And it's amazing for a guy who had won the greatest landslide, one of the greatest landslides in American history, 1964, to bow out of the race in 1968 because he would have been crushed, right? And it was Vietnam. Johnson always said that the Great Society was my wife, and Vietnam was my, he said the Great Society was my girlfriend who I loved and I adored, and the Vietnam War was my bitch of a wife who I hated, but I couldn't get rid of one and I couldn't get rid of the other, and I was stuck with them both. And that was what sank Johnson's presidency. He couldn't pay for the Great Society the way he wanted and the Vietnam War. He couldn't abandon the Great Society. What was the presidency for? On the other hand, you couldn't abandon the Vietnam War. You'd have been eaten alive, right, for the first president to lose a war. And so instead, Johnson kind of half-assed them both. Right, and Vietnam turned into a disaster that consumed 40 years of American politics and hundreds of thousands of lives, right? Millions if you include the Vietnamese, right? And it was a disaster, right? And so what happens in '68? The Democrats have their convention in Chicago. The Republicans have their convention and smoothly nominate Richard Nixon, who comes back from political exile, swoops in to present himself as the man of the hour, right? Former two-term vice president, here to save the day, right? Johnson can't. He doesn't even go to the convention. Yeah.
He gets assassinated
In '64, probably.
The question was, would Kennedy have won if he had?
Oh, Bobby Kennedy? Yeah, easily. Yeah. Kennedy gets assassinated in. He wins the California primary, and this a clear path to the presidency. He is gonna do it. The incumbent can't beat him. The incumbent can't win an election against him. Kennedy's going to rack up such a delegate lead. He's going to go to the convention and, win, right? Walking out of the ballroom, saying his acceptance speech for the California primary, Kennedy's assassinated by a Palestinian guy named Sirhan, who empties a .38 caliber revolver into him and kills him. And so this is like June, I think, and it's too much for people to bear. King and then Kennedy, who else, right? And so the Democrats have their convention and they nominate Humphrey, but there's a literal riot outside. The news coverage is alternating clips of the delegates and the police like beating the living shit out of people in the streets. And of course the Republicans are just like, okay, say nothing, yeah, all right. When your opponents are going to tear themselves apart, you just let it happen. And so what does Nixon do? He projects strength and authority, right? I'm going to end the rioting in the inner cities, which many Northerners at this point are happy to hear, even if it means curtailing the gains made by black people. And for Southerners in the civil rights, Southern conservatives, what this means when he says law and order, what they hear is no civil rights, right? No civil rights. It's what they call a dog whistle, which the term comes into use in American politics this time. When you blow the dog whistle, nobody hears except dogs and they bark. When you say law and order, everybody else says, okay, cops or whatever. And what Southern conservatives hear is beating up black people for protesting, right? And so Nixon cruises to an easy victory, right? His victory is virtually assured. He beats Humphrey, and there's no question. And what does Nixon do? On the one hand, Nixon empowers the kind of Southern conservatives who want to roll back the civil rights movement, right? And on the other hand, Nixon also does end the Vietnam War, right? He does negotiate a withdrawal from the Vietnam War. And of course, famously, he opens up relations with communist China, which we have not had since, 1949, when it was founded. Yeah. And he meets Chairman Mao. So again, Nixon is like a good president or a bad president, kind of the word. Like, he cheated to win the 1972 election. I'm not a crook. When someone says they're not a crook, it's because they are a crook, right? And Johnson hated that his legacy was in the hands of this awful, Richard Nixon, right? And so what can you say about Johnson's presidency? It's a tragedy. It's a Greek tragedy. The very qualities that got Johnson to the presidency kind of ensured his downfall, right? And yet a guy who did anything to get himself to the presidency also use the powers in a direct way. If you are an African American, the two presidents that cared the most about what happened to you were Abraham Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson. Lincoln freed the slaves, and Johnson was the first president to openly, completely, full-heartedly support the civil rights movement. Yeah.
To counter you there, that while he may have openly supported the civil rights movement, he did not move as many things as his conversations with Martin Luther King
Yeah,
and
yeah.
things
I mean,
like that.
he was always
Yeah. I mean, he was always careful about the politics of it. Of course, Johnson, if he were here to defend himself, would say, "Look, if I gotta act within the system I've got," but he pushed harder on that system than anybody else, right? He got civil rights bills through Congress. He got the Voting Rights Act through Congress on his own initiative. He made those things happen.
president who would
No,
have come
there's
to,
no other president who would have come to. A Republican would have just been shot down by Democrats because the Southerners would have been like, "We're going to vote for a bill by a Republican. Forget it." Right? And it had to be a Democrat, and a Northern Democrat would have been stonewalled by
enough to
Southerners.
be able.
But Johnson was a Southerner, enough to be able to and at the end of the day, he just ran roughshod over the Southerners. I mean, when they wouldn't cooperate, they knew this is the end of segregation, right? I mean, if these bills pass, the thing that we love will literally become illegal. It's just a question of a court challenge until it's, is you can't. But Johnson basically backed them into a corner and said, "Okay, either you're with me or I'm going to crush you." And some of them went with him, and the rest he crushed. Right, and he said to Russell, "It's too late. Right, we've got the votes, and you can either we will abolish the filibuster and pass whatever the hell you want, right, whatever we want, or I mean, you can, the struggle for the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights are epic. I mean, it simultaneously involves these mass protests because Johnson told King, go protest like as hard as you can, put as much pressure on the political system because then I can say, look, I mean, listen to those people, right? We've got to do something. And at the same time, Johnson also is this incredible minutia. Howard K. Smith is the chairman of the Rules Committee in the House. And to get the bill onto the floor of the House, you have to get a discharge petition, which has like 60% of the votes to his door. And then he would be required to discharge the bill from the committee. And so like Johnson is meeting with Republican and Democratic congressmen saying like, get votes, like go rally the troops and force Smith to let this go. And it's this incredible, like this weird story about like protest marches and like weird legal maneuverings in the Congress, but all leading to these civil rights bills. And so, yeah, Johnson was not the president that King would have wanted. King would have wanted a guy who pushed more and harder, but Johnson pushed more and harder than anybody else ever had, and he got things done.
Right. And of course, that's a very qualified way to support civil rights.
Oh yeah.
There's nothing unqualified about it. Right. But in the harsh, cold light of day, Johnson got the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed. He got the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed. Those are not nothing. Right. The Voting Rights Act was transformational. And there were by the time Nixon got impeached, Barbara Jordan was a black congresswoman on the impeachment committee, which would never have happened had the Voting Rights Act not let black people vote her into office. Right.
Voting rights.
Putting voting rights on the agenda as starkly as you did, it made things like Florida's restoring voting rights felons like a big deal, right? And so, of course, the Voting Rights Act doesn't really exist anymore because Shelby County, Alabama v. Holder, 2013 Supreme Court case, basically gutted the enforcement provision of the act. And so the act, states cannot take the right to vote away from people, but also people whose right to vote gets taken away do not have a way to sue the state. There's no way for the government to force the states to rectify those errors, except on like a case-by-case basis. And so that was, again, Shelby County, Alabama v. Holder was the case. Right. So I think Johnson is a sort of tragic figure, deeply flawed guy, cheated on his wife like basically all the time, right? Totally corrupt, right? Completely involved in oil companies, dirty money. He steered contracts towards Brown and Root, his buddies. I made them a major company because they paid for him to get elected, right? On the other hand, again, a guy who genuinely tried to use the power of the government to help people who he felt needed it. And so, I mean, it's hard to wrap your mind around it, right? But I think Johnson, he was hated when he was in office. Liberals hated his support for the Vietnam War. But on the other hand, I think we're going to think differently about him as time goes on. Yeah.
Heather wanted to know, did Nixon end the war just to be the opposite of a Democrat?
Nixon ended the war because I think he thought that it was stupid. It was a giant waste of time. And he personally also, it had consumed Johnson. Is it Heather West? Is Heather Perry? Yeah, Heather Perry. There's two Heathers. And so, no, I think part of it is that. Part of it is Nixon's hubris for Nixon to say, I did this thing that consumed, this monster slew Johnson's presidency. I dispatched it, right? I was the one that. But I think also Nixon privately was a practitioner of realpolitik and felt like, why are we wasting time in Vietnam? It's a totally irrelevant country. Who cares? Right? I mean, we need money and troops to defend Berlin from the commies and, Japan and like Western Europe. Why are we wasting our time and effort in the jungles of Vietnam? Right? It's just completely ridiculous. Right? And so, I think that there's a lot going on why Nixon does it, but sure, the ability to take a victory lap on Johnson's face is a big deal. But I think Nixon also just privately thought it was dumb, right? And it was sort of an intellectual thing. Could I do this? Am I smart enough to make this happen? Am I? And of course, and by the way, in 1968, Nixon committed arguably treason by ordering through a back channel. He got the South Vietnamese to collapse the peace negotiations that might have ended the war in 1968 in return for a promise that if he won, which he would if they collapsed the negotiations, he would give them a better deal than Johnson was prepared to support. And they did. It was General Duc Van Minh who, through a back channel, he pulled the plug on the negotiations, and that just killed Humphrey. I mean, Humphrey was probably not going to win anyway, but that certainly didn't help. And I mean, that's Nixon, as a private citizen, violated the Logan Act, which prohibits the practice of foreign policy by private American citizens. You had a question too.
Fighting an unpopular war and history looking back on something differently than they were at the time, do you think W is going to receive a similar treatment? Yeah.
Okay, I'm rephrasing that. What you said was fighting an unpopular war and looking back, and do you think that people are going to change how they look at George W. Bush?
That's 100%.
That's 100%. Like, Bush was hated when he left office. There's no question. Probably more than any other modern president. I think that the history is not even going to be that kind to him. I think that the Iraq War will be looked at as a titanically stupid episode in abject failure, and it was going to be dumb from the get-go.
Do you feel that he was responsible for that, or he was being manipulated into?
What's that? Oh yeah, Tim wants to know: do I think George W. Bush was manipulating the Iraq War? Was he responsible? The answer is yes. He got bad advice from guys like Paul Wolfowitz and Doug Feith. Yeah, weird that those all pop up again, right? The oil companies and stuff. And like Doug Feith used to just make stuff up. And they called him his office was like the Office of Strategic Analysis, and the Army called it the Office of Faith-Based Analysis. And was Paul Wolfowitz, who General Tommy Franks called the dumbest motherfucker on the planet. And these guys had this idea: we'll be greeted as liberators. There's WMDs everywhere. Saddam Hussein is uniquely evil. Everybody in Iraq is crying out to be free. They believed Ahmed Khalabi, who was the head of the Iraqi National Congress, who sold them a fake version of Iraq. And so, yeah, I think Bush made a decision based off of incredibly bad advice that he lacked the capacity to determine was bad. But on the other hand, remember Truman said, the buck stops here, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're the president, you own it. And so that's on Bush's like tombstone, right? I mean, it's what he's going to be remembered for the rest of his life, is the guy that started the Iraq War and didn't find the WMD. And by the way, it ended super great, right? No, it was a freaking disaster, right? It led to, ISIS and all other horrible stuff. And to be fair, there's a lot more. There's a
horrible person.
He kept the lid on things, and it turned out when you get rid of him, like boy.
And you can repeat what
Tim said Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, but I mean,
he kept the lid on things, and it turned out when you get rid of him, like boy, bad guy. But I mean, he kept things under control. Yeah, absolutely. He kept the lid on things in Iraq, and as soon as he was gone, the country basically boiled over like Myanmar. I don't see us invading, or Cuba or like Venezuela. But for some reason, yeah, but I mean, I think George W. Bush. The comparison between Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam happened like 2 minutes after it started, and I think it's pretty reasonable. But there's a point where George W. Bush didn't want to keep doing these things, but you can't extricate yourself, right? And then Obama got elected, basically promising to end the Iraq War, which turned very mature. But of course, you can understand why Obama did it, because he's like, well, 80% of people in the country want me to do it. 97% of Democrats who voted for me want me to do it. Like, what do you want me to do? Do pull a Johnson and turn around and say I can't? Right? It would have destroyed his presidency. Yeah. It's a whole other. Yeah, it's a whole George W. Bush whole other thing. Yeah. Are there any? If anybody else got questions, let me know.
There is a whole conclave of people who are upset that you won't talk about NASA.
Next time.
I mean, what about now? Like the space program under Kennedy?
They want to talk about the Johnson
Space Center. Well, yeah, I mean, Johnson got the Space Center, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory stuff. Why is it called the Johnson Space Center? Because it happened during the Johnson presidency. And where is the Johnson Space Center located? It's in Texas. And why is it in Texas? Because Johnson's from Texas. Right? Olivia would like everyone to see her spacesuit because she is a member of NASA. Right? NASA. And so we're talking about NASA. She went and got the spacesuit. You want to put it on?
Put it on.
Okay, put it on.
Yeah.
Give me Mr. Tim can help you put it on.
And so Okay, put it on.
Okay, put it on. I mean, Johnson, the space program was Kennedy's baby. I mean, it was his idea. Like, I believe we could send a man to the moon by the end of the decade. But Johnson supported it, and of course, it was another opportunity to like spend federal money in his home state, get his name on something, and it was the greatest feather in your cap of all time, right? I mean, these achievements, these incredible technological achievements, nobody ever did anything like this before. So of course, rockets orbiting the Earth and satellites and telecommunications, and of course, by the Nixon presidency, we landed a guy on the moon. 1969, put a guy on the moon, and so nobody else had ever done anything like that. Yeah.
Hawk would like you to know it was him.
It was him.
He wanted to know. I was trying to do
yes.
Okay,
Okay, I will put it over my shoulder because I have the NASA. I'll let people see the NASA patch, right? So Johnson did have a mark on the space program, and that's I think a big thing. But again, for Johnson, I don't know that he was a scientifically minded guy. I don't know. I think Kennedy honestly thought this was an amazing thing and a bold frontier of human achievement. I think Johnson mostly thought like, I'm not going to pull the plug on this because it's like a thing that Kennedy had done, and I don't want to do it. I don't want to undo it. But I think also it was just a way to get like his name on stuff, right? I mean, I think it was all just a way to have his imprimatur on a thing that Kennedy had started, right? And of course, Nixon was the one that got to actually Nixon was the guy who got to put a guy on the moon, despite doing nothing and just getting elected president like the year before it happened, right? Which is but Nixon took all the credit, right? So there's the space program in 2 seconds.
Space, the much abbreviated version of the space program. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions here, and we're kind of up on 90 minutes, and the kids are getting restless. So I think we'll go ahead and sign off.
One thing is, if anybody has ideas for topics, you can. Yes.
Okay, if you have an idea for a topic, please submit them to the comments.
Post it in the
comment, and we will consider those when we go next week to do our next thing.
Okay, and in other words, I think we're going to say goodbye because kids want water.
Girls.
So
we will see you next week. Bye.
yeah, sun's going down.